Hi everyone, I hope you're all having a great week. The inspiration for this week's painting came from my Cormier Pigments Pearl Luster watercolor set, and the color I chose to focus on was bronze. It's a color I've used in a few different paintings, but it's not a color I use very frequently, and I want to get more comfortable with it because I do find it quite pretty. Bronze, of course, makes me think of metal, and so I felt inspired to create a geologic abstract. I decided to start my painting process with another color I don't use very frequently, and that color is raw sienna. The colors I don't use very frequently are usually the colors I don't feel that comfortable working with, and so the only way I'll ever feel comfortable working with them is if I actually do it. And so that's why I'm challenging myself to create a painting using some colors that I'm not used to working with, and I'm hoping that as I'm going along, I'll get more comfortable with them. Van Dyke Brown is a color I actually do use on a relatively frequent occasion. It's a color I really like. It's a beautiful, rich brown, and I think it'll be really good for this geologic abstract to use a color like this. For the focal point of my painting, I'll use some lighter colors to create a layer of rock. Oops, it looks like I dipped my brush in a color I wasn't really intending on putting here, but I'm gonna make it work. Actually, this is perfect because even though I was intending on using lighter colors for that section of the painting, rock in nature wouldn't only be one color, and so it's probably a good idea for me to start adding in a little bit more color in that area to make it look more natural, but definitely not realistic. This is by far not a realistic painting. This is a geologic abstract, and it's gonna, sort of mimic or give an impression of rock, but it's not gonna be looking exactly like rock. Still, I wanna play with my paints, and I wanna see how I can blend a few little colors into my painting to make the background look more interesting. Using some light red and some blue, I'm going to create a bluish gray that I'll also include in the painting. After I let my first layer dry, I'm coming back in with a little bit of water, and I'm going to start working with a color that I actually use in a lot of my paintings. It's a color that's very versatile, and that color is called neutral tint. Since I'm working with very earthy colors, I decided I was also going to pull out my Decadent Pies palette because there's a color in there called Pecan that I really love. And it's a nice earthy red that's sort of like a dark, like a reddish brown, I guess. I really like it, and I think it's going to look really nice in this painting, so I decided to pull it out and see what magic I can create with it. Now I'm back to my main palette, and I'm going to go over these sections I just painted with the pecan color using some quinacridone deep gold. This color tends to brighten up other colors, and that reddish brown that the pecan color offers is really nice, but I want to make it look a little bit richer. So this deep gold, quinacridone deep gold, I think is really going to do the trick. And at this point, I'm really happy with the background I've created. So after I'm done applying this paint, I'm going to let it dry, and then I'm going to move forward to starting to add some details using my pens and markers. I looked at my background carefully, and then I used my fountain pen to draw in a few lines to get my process going. I often like to create more rounded shapes when I'm creating sort of abstract, whimsical looking rocks, but in this instance I don't really have the intention of using any of the techniques in neurographic art for this painting in particular. So I'm just going to use lines that are a little bit more jagged and irregular, because I think they're more reminiscent of what would actually we'd find underground, if you will. Again, this is just an abstract representation of rocks. It's not the real thing, and I'm not really trying to go for a realistic look. I'm just trying to create a fun little painting that will help me experiment with that bronze color that I like so much but don't use very often. And with just a few little lines, I'm already feeling really happy with how my process is going. A few little cracks above and below that layer of rock will probably look really cool. So I'm going to add a few and take it from there. My intuitive painting process, as I've mentioned before, is really about taking it one step at a time. And one decision leads into another decision. And oftentimes I don't know exactly what my painting is going to look like until the very end. because I really am deciding moment by moment what I'm going to do next. It's really a great way for me to work because it takes away the pressure of being so focused on an end result and having my painting need to look a certain way. I really can decide as I go along what I want my painting to look like. And it's often a really nice surprise in the end when I'm finished to see what my painting does look like, because I might have a general idea when I get going of what I'd like to create, especially in an instance like this where I picked a color and I said I'm gonna create a geologic abstract. So I kind of had an idea, but I really don't completely know what my painting's gonna look like until it's finished. And I like that element of surprise. And this is the perfect example of a decision that led into another decision. I decided that it might look nice for me to add these little lines that looked like cracks underneath my rocks, and after I was done adding them, I felt compelled to add some stippling under my rock. I flipped my substrate around and I'm going to start working on the top portion of my painting. And since I already like what I've done on the bottom, why reinvent the wheel? I'm just going to sort of replicate what I did up above, or down below, I guess, because in this case the painting has been flipped. So what I'm working on right now is actually the top part of the painting. So I'm going to replicate what I did on the bottom, but I'm going to try to make my lines a little bit different, and I don't want things to be too uniform. So I'm going to try to make my lines not just a little bit different, but put them in different areas. I've decided to move in a little bit closer in case some of you haven't seen what stippling looks like before. So stippling is basically a very simple technique where you add little dots in an area. And the thicker or the closer the dots are together, the darker the area will look, and then you sort of peter off and make your dots a little bit wider apart. I love this effect because it does seem to create some nice shadowing and can actually give sometimes a bit of a three-dimensional feeling to a painting. But what I like most about it is that it's so simple. It's really just dotting your pen down on the paper repetitively. And because it's a simple, repetitive technique, it's also very relaxing. You don't have to think about it too much. You just do it and you focus your mind on what you're doing, and it really helps to bring you in the present moment. Now that I'm finished adding these fun little details in black, I finally feel ready to start using my bronze. So I generally like to try and put as little paint as possible in the water I'm using. So I will tend to clean my brushes on paper towels, and the paper towels that I use that have paint on them, I save them. and I use them as backgrounds for paintings. At some point, I'm going to make a video showing that process. But I also don't like to dip my brush in my water too often, so I tend to use a pipette to get water from my water container, and I put water in my palette, and I try to do that as much as possible. And this is what I think, for me anyway, is one of the better ways to do it, because if I'm not dipping my brush in my water all the time, I'm not sending any paint particles in our waterways when I pour my water down the drain. So I'm not saying there's never any paint particles. Sometimes there are, of course, but for the most part, I try to keep that on my paper towels. And the fact that I'm using my paper towels as backgrounds for other paintings, it feels like in some ways maybe I'm doing something good for the environment. Am I 100% sure of this? I don't know. But at least I know that the paper towels I'm using are being put to good use, and there's less paint going down the drain. So one thing to note about what I'm doing right now, I'm just basically dotting the bronze color onto the painting using a micro mini brush. I was sort of feeling as I was going along that this might have not been a good idea, and the only reason I don't think it's a good idea is that I started noticing that the bristles at the end of my brush were starting to look like they were curving a little bit, like they were being bent. So another way that you could create the dotting that I'm creating right now is to use a dotting tool. I've used my dotting tools, dipped them directly in my paint pans, and use them to dot paint on my paintings, and it works quite well. And of course, dotting tools are typically made of metal, so you don't have to worry about ruining the tip of a brush. I paint a lot with my micro mini brush, and so it may just be that it's not because I'm doing this right now and that my brush is just used, because it is very frequently used. And so it just may be, you know, normal wear and tear. But I don't feel like I've ever really noticed that the ends of my bristles were bending this way before. So I think the fact that I was doing this, that up and down motion, dabbing the paint on the paper, that might have been bending the bristles a little bit. So just something to keep in mind. Art supplies are expensive, typically. And if we want to elongate the life of our supplies, these are things, you know, to be mindful of, I guess. Oh wow, when that bronze catches the light a certain way, it looks pretty spectacular. I wouldn't say I love it more than my star gold. I think that's always going to be my top choice, but that bronze is actually very shimmery, and it looks so pretty against these colors that are in the background. I thought at this point that I was finished with my painting process, so I decided to take my tape off the paper and had a closer look at it. And once I looked at it without the tape, I wanted to add a few more details, which I'll show you in just a minute. I'm really liking my painting so far. It's monochromatic, it's got some nice contrast with the matte paints and the iridescent paints, and the colors sort of blend really well together. But I felt like I could add a few more details within my quote-unquote rock formations, so I decided to pull my extra fine tip black pen and add some vertical lines to some of my rocks. Subtle little details like this are very easy to create, and I like the fact that they're, like I said, very subtle, and in order to really see them and capture them, they sort of invite the viewer to move in a little bit closer. So I like to add details like this in my painting. And I'm surprised I didn't think to do it earlier, but like I said, when I'm painting intuitively, I just kind of go moment by moment and see what I feel called to doing. And in this case, I felt called to doing this after I was done removing my tape. So I just go with it. To make these little rock formations even just a little bit more interesting, I've decided to come in with my fountain pen, and I'm adding a few dots to each of these shapes. None of what I'm doing right now is very complicated, and yet it adds a lot more interest to the painting. I really love looking at these little details, and I'm glad I decided to add them. All right, now I'm feeling ready for some close-ups, and I love how shimmery that bronze paint is and how it catches the light when you move it. Cormier Pigments really seems to have found a magic recipe when it comes to making their paints shimmery. It's like no other shimmery paint I've ever seen, or iridescent paint I've ever seen. They almost look like real metal, like when they're applied on paper, and I really like that. It's an interesting thing that paint can recreate that kind of look. How do you like to use your iridescent paints? It's always so much fun for me to read your comments every week, and I'll look forward to seeing what you have to say this time around. Thank you for making the time to join me on this little creative journey. I hope you have a wonderful week, and happy creating!